South Africans are in for tough economic times following an over R2.30 rise in the petrol price, which kicked in at midnight. It's despite yesterday's announcement by National Treasury that the temporary fuel levy relief would be extended by a further 2 months. For more on the global impact of the cost of living crisis, we're joined by economist Dr. David Makovah and Economic Justice Program Coordination at the Alternative Information and Development Center, Elroy, Paulus. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. David, perhaps let me begin with you. You know, when we look at where we are as a country, it's very easy to think that South Africa is the only country going through this turmoil in as far as the increase in cost of living is concerned. And what we've been warned, including by the United Nations, is an impending food shortage worldwide. Talk to me about where we are globally.
So this is being experienced across the continent, across other parts of the world. On the African continent, we're the most vulnerable. Fundamentally, the bulk of this crisis has been sparked by the war between Russia and the Ukraine. That's pushed up oil prices in excess of 75% relative to where we were at last year. At the same time, what it's done is it's made the wheat and the grains that we access from that part of the world, Russia and the Ukraine being some of the biggest producers of wheat, inaccessible as a result of the war. So we in Africa are the most vulnerable, and we're feeling this effect much more than, let's say, North Americans, Europeans, etc., and so forth.
Elroy, when we take a look at, you know, how different countries are responding to these crises, what have you seen that perhaps has stood out for you in these responses, especially when it comes to cushioning, you know, those that are within their borders?
As Mr. Mack has said, the effects are dire. You have food price increases. You've got a 50 basis point interest rate increase. And you know that saying, if I could wax political for a moment, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere chaos is loosed upon the world. Second Coming, William Yeats, also the title of the book by Chinua Achebe. I have never, in my career since the mid-90s in the NGO sector, seen the concomitant and concurrent effects of so many variables that makes food security so much more problematic. So the MRC recently produced a report on food security, especially on the impact of children. I now see people in LSM 1 to 5 choose to walk between stations to save 10 rand between just for transportation. So the fundamental needs are now being traded, saving on transportation, which previously could be bought, in order to buy food. And when there's food that is unaffordable, MRC report and many others again say families, caregivers, mainly mothers, go hungry in order to make sure that their children have something to eat, for those who are able to afford food. So the implications are dire. It is a maelstrom of factors that is causing further deprivation, and I really think that it is time for the state to man up and challenge the fundamental principles and programs that they have chosen to adopt, not forced to adopt, chosen to adopt, that requires them to keep investors and the World Bank and those that design structural adjustment programs happy. They should serve its people.
David, you know, Elroy is raising a very important issue because ultimately navigating these waters is largely going to depend on the decisions that are being made by leaders in independent countries. And, you know, when you look at where South Africa is right now, how critical do you think the role of leadership is going to be? And are we even at the point where we fully acknowledge where the whole of society is, not just the middle class, not just the elite, but even where the poorest of the poor in this country are?
Yeah. So just some typical stats. Maize globally is up 36%. Wheat is up 70%. That makes the core of your staples. The oil price, as I mentioned earlier, is up 40%. But the challenge with the oil price is it has an impact on everything because everything has to be moved, whether we're in the services sector, but particularly when we're in the goods sector, everything has to be moved. So it has secondary round inflationary impacts which affect the poor the most. Now, the big question is, what can the government do about it? What can any government, but particularly the leaders in the governments on the continent, do about it? And the difficult answer is it's really, really difficult. These factors affecting food prices and fuel prices are exogenous. That's a fancy word I use with clients to say it's external. We cannot impact what's happening in Russia, in Ukraine, the fight that the Americans and NATO are having with the Russians. What we can do locally and what the government is trying to do, we can have a debate on whether we think it's adequate or inadequate, is to cushion the blow. So the extension of not increasing the fuel levy is an example of that. They're saying we're going to absorb this loss of income. The extension of some of the social grants, which we saw introduced during COVID and increased slightly with the budget announcements, that's what the government is trying to do. But they're operating within a very, very limited revenue envelope. So it's how we strike a balance. And what you're going to find is that you're going to have people who are saying, hold on, we are doing something, but we're not doing enough. And those people who say the government cannot afford to remain fiscally responsible and do more than they're doing now.
Mm. Elroy, so it sounds to me that if the warning is of things getting worse before they get better, we need a lot more sustainable interventions than just perhaps the ad hoc responses, at least of the face of it, as what we've seen right now.
That's true, but if I could respond by taking up what Mr. Mack has just said. Sure. It's true that the state cannot do everything to everybody, but I certainly believe that it can do much more. And what it has to do, the much more that is required, is to make that which was outsourced and external, internal. Let me give you an example. One of the conscious decisions of Minister Enoch Godongwana was to provide for big businesses to enable them to take their profits and have the foreign offshore investment up from 45% to 55%. Change that, Minister Godongwana. Don't be fiscally irresponsible, but at the least you could make provision for people, not just soup kitchens and funding of NGOs and NPOs. The situation is dire because it's systemically dire. It's not just a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a response to poverty in the short term. So much has to be done, so much has to be revised, and I think some of this requires principles that government have adopted, decisions that they've made to be seriously reviewed.
All right. Well, certainly a conversation we can continue a lot longer on. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. Dr. David Makovah is an economist, and you also heard there from Elroy Paulus, who is with the Alternative Information and Development Center.